You've brought us a really fascinating article today, Singular Scientists.
Yeah, it's quite something.
And our mission really is to unpack its core idea.
Yeah.
This possibility that several, well, really famous scientists might have had characteristics we'd now associate with Asperger's syndrome.
Exactly.
So we're going to, dive into the analysis in the article, look at the specific examples, Newton, Einstein, people like that, and just explore what the source suggests about maybe a link between these traits and, well, major scientific success, all based purely on the information you brought in.
That's the plan. And the article starts right at the beginning, really, with how we even started thinking about these traits in a modern way. It goes back to Hans Asperger.
Right, the Viennese pediatrician.
Yeah, him. And his doctoral thesis way back in 1944.
1944. So this is before autism was widely understood like it is now. What did he notice?
Well, he described these children he saw as mildly autistic, but the key thing he noted was that they were also remarkably able.
Able in what way?
Particularly, he saw this strong preference for abstract thinking, for abstract content. And he noticed they often ended up being really successful in jobs needing mathematical skills. Mathematicians, technologists, industrial chemists, even high-up civil servants.
Huh. So right from the outset, he wasn't just seeing social differences, he was linking it to a specific kind of intellectual ability and career path.
Precisely. And that led him to think about what professional success really takes. He sort of felt it demanded this single-mindedness.
Single-mindedness.
Yeah, like a willingness to really narrow your focus, maybe give up other interests that most people pursue. He contrasted it with people who might be talented in lots of areas, but maybe choose the wrong path because of it.
And he saw this intense focus as a positive thing, an advantage.
Very much so, yeah. He talked about how these individuals would go their own way, driven by this collected energy and obvious confidence. And this interesting phrase, a blinkered attitude towards life's rich rewards.
Blinkered, meaning not distracted by everyday stuff.
Mm-hmm. Kind of, yeah. Like they weren't easily pulled off track by, social status or typical pleasures. Their talents just directed them intensely. And then he made this really strong statement, the one the source quotes.
The really famous one.
That's the one. It seems that for success in science or art, a dash of autism is essential.
Wow. Essential. That's a big claim. How did he back that up?
His thinking was that real breakthroughs require you to turn away from the everyday world. You need to be able to rethink things completely with originality. And to do that, your abilities need to be, as he put it, canalized into the one specialty.
Canalized, like channeled very narrowly.
Exactly. That intense focus, maybe even that separation from normal social pressures, he saw that as the key ingredient for originality.
Okay, so that's Asperger back in the 40s. How does the article connect that to how we understand Asperger's syndrome today?
Right. So the source explains today's understanding. It's seen as a high-functioning variant of autism. Usually people diagnosed have good language skills, good intelligence, sometimes even better social insight than in other forms of autism.
And diagnosis.
Typically involves, a standard list of questions. But the core things the source highlights are, 1, social impairment, real difficulty with social interactions, reading cues, that sort of thing. And 2, this intense preoccupation with certain subjects.
Okay, social challenges and intense interests. Got it. And it's not super rare.
The source says maybe more than 1 person in 1,000. So, yeah, not extremely rare.
So using that modern framework, the author looks back at these historical scientists. Who are the main ones discussed?
The big ones are Isaac Newton, Henry Cavendish, and Albert Einstein.
Heavy hitters.
Definitely. And the author mentions that Simon Baron-Cohen, he's a psychiatrist who runs an autism research center at Cambridge, apparently looked at the information available.
Oh, a contemporary expert weighed in.
Yeah, according to the source. And Baron-Cohen felt Newton and Einstein seemed fairly certain fits for the criteria, and Cavendish likely too, though maybe there's less known about his early life.
Okay, having a modern expert agree, even based on historical records, does add some weight to the article's idea.
It does lend it some credibility, yeah. The author also thinks maybe Marie Curie, her daughter Irene Joliot-Curie, and the physicist Paul Dirac could fit the pattern too. The article mentions possibly others in arts, like Turner or Wittgenstein, but it really zooms in on the scientists.
Right. Let's stick with the scientists then. Let's get into the specific characteristics the source talks about and how they might have shown up in these individuals' lives. It seems a big one is challenges with, like, social stuff.
Yeah, that's a major theme. Things like feeling profoundly alone or just not being very interested in typical social chat and finding it hard to make friends.
Examples.
Well, Newton's childhood is described as lonely and loveless, pretty bleak. And Henry Cavendish, a contemporary, apparently said he seemed to see himself as a solitary being who felt unfit for society.
Unfit for society, wow.
And there's that famous story, right, where some distinguished scientists wanted to meet him, and Cavendish apparently got so flustered he couldn't speak and just, fled, ran out, got in his carriage, and left.
Okay, yeah, running away in your carriage that's more than just being a bit shy, isn't it?
Definitely paints a picture. And Einstein, he apparently said, "I'm not much with people." Simple as that. Described as shy, lonely, withdrawn as a kid.
Hmm.
And one biographer wrote that Einstein never really needed human contacts, that he sort of deliberately cut himself off from emotional dependence.
So the source suggests this isn't just like preferring your own company, but maybe a fundamental difference in understanding or engaging with the social world.
That's kind of the idea. It connects to that concept of folk psychology, the sort of built-in intuition most people have for reading others' minds and intentions. If that's less developed, social interactions could be genuinely confusing or maybe just seem less compelling than, say, the logic of physics.
Right, so maybe not an active dislike, but just a different wiring or a different set of priorities where social connection isn't the main driver.
That seems to be the angle the source takes, and it could also show up in how they communicated. Newton, for instance, might have deliberately made his masterpiece, the Principia, really hard to understand, abstruse, the source says.
Why would you do that?
Maybe to avoid arguments or criticism. He apparently preferred silence to public debate.
Interesting.
And Cavendish was famously quiet. The source quotes someone saying, "He probably uttered fewer words than any man who lived to fourscore years, not at all excepting the monks of La Trappe."
Fewer words than a silent monk. That's memorable.
It is, isn't it? And Einstein was pretty blunt about it. "I do not socialize because social encounters would distract me from my work, and I really only live for that." So he directly links avoiding socializing to protecting his focus.
Right, back to that intense focus again. Did this difficulty extend to friendships?
Yeah, the source suggests so. For Newton, as a kid, apparently never known scarce to play with the boys abroad. Later descriptions paint him as singularly unable to form intimate friendships.
Singularly unable. Strong words.
Yeah, and also morbidly suspicious and secretive, prone to peevish outbreaks of his temper, getting into painful controversies. The suggestion is he maybe lacked the social skills to navigate disagreements smoothly.
Okay. And Einstein.
Also described as lonely and dreamy as a child, struggled to make friends. Seems he made a conscious choice quite early to be a separate entity, not letting others influence him much. Even colleagues like Lise Meitner apparently noticed an elusive coldness about him.
Elusive coldness. That sounds tough for working relationships, too.
It could be. Another colleague concluded he was just a naturally solitary person who didn't like showing weakness or being helped. And Irene Joliot-Curie gets mentioned here, too.
Marie Curie's daughter.
Yeah. The source says she had great difficulties greeting strangers, making friends, never really got the hang of small talk, and could come across as insensitive.
Okay, so a real pattern of social challenges across these figures, according to the source. The article also brings up something that seems almost trivial. Peculiar dress. How does that fit in?
Well, the source frames it as potentially another sign of disregarding social norms or what other people think.
Ah, okay.
Newton was apparently untidy and slovenly. The source gets specific. Shoes down at heel, stockings untied, hair barely combed, even when formally dressed in a surplice.
Right, not just casual, but actually messy.
Yeah. Cavendish, on the other hand, stuck rigidly to an old-fashioned style faded violet suit, high collar, frilly cuffs, old periwig. Apparently he just got an exact copy made new each year.
So, consistent but out of step.
Exactly. And Einstein's approach was different again, but still nonconformist. He famously had, 7 identical suits for formal things? Which is very routine-based.
Right, takes the decision-making out of it.
But his everyday wear was super casual sweatshirts, leather jackets, sandals. So it wasn't necessarily about being unkempt, more about not following the usual social rules about appearance.
Okay, so another way of just doing their own thing, basically.
That's how the source seems to see it, yeah. Moving on from the social side, another big theme is the intensity of their focus and their maybe unusual ways of thinking. This is where the article really links it to their scientific achievements.
Right, the potential upside.
Yeah. So things like strong adherence to routine, and especially obsessive behavior.
Routines first.
Okay. Cavendish was described as very much a man of habit. Always eat the same thing for dinner, leg of mutton, apparently.
Every day. Wow.
Seems like it. And took the exact same walk every day alone, wearing his old three-cornered hat. Einstein had his habit of sailing his dinghy alone for years. And later, in America, his sort of only friend in Princeton was Kurt Gödel, the mathematician. Gödel would apparently call for him at 11 a.m. sharp every day, and they'd walk for a mile no matter the weather.
So these routines, maybe they provided structure, predictability, freed up brain space for the real work.
That's a plausible interpretation the source hints at, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the obsessive side.
Which could be good or bad, I guess.
Exactly. The source argues that when that obsessiveness is channeled into scientific problems, it can be the driving force behind huge discoveries. Newton, for example, loved making models as a kid, and that grew into a passion for building scientific instruments.
Okay, that sounds productive.
But the source points out he also had other obsessions that were less commendable by normal standards, like alchemy, which grew out of his chemistry work, but still.
Right, alchemy.
And this compulsion to draft papers over and over again, like 18 drafts for one chapter. Plus, obsessively copying routine documents when he worked at the Mint and his deep dives into biblical chronology and prophecies.
So the same intense focus applied everywhere, whether it was physics or, well, prophecies.
Yeah, the intensity seems key. Marie Curie's relentless drive to isolate radium is described as having an obsessive quality. And the source also mentions she kept super detailed records of household spending, maybe another sign of that meticulous, almost compulsive need for order or data.
Interesting connection between the personal habit and the scientific drive. How did this intensity or difference affect how they actually thought about science or communicated it?
Good question. The source gives examples here, too. Newton, again, very few words, usually silent, thoughtful. When he did speak, it was supposedly very much to the purpose.
Correct.
Very. He'd answer questions sharply, but rarely start a conversation himself, which is quite different from someone who enjoys batting ideas around verbally.
Sure.
Einstein, interestingly, was apparently a confusing lecturer.
Really? Einstein?
Yeah. He'd give examples, then jump to principles that didn't seem connected, sometimes lose his place. The source links this to a predominantly visual style of thinking. He apparently said he rarely thinks in words at all. The thoughts come, maybe as images, and then he tries to translate them into words afterwards.
Ah, thinking visually, not verbally. That makes sense. It could make explaining things tricky. That's fascinating.
It really is. And Paul Dirac, like Cavendish, was extremely taciturn, very quiet. He apparently said he learned not to even start talking unless he knew exactly how the sentence would end.
Wow. Planning the whole sentence first?
Seems like it. A colleague said trying to talk to him was hard. You'd ask a question, wait ages, then get just a yes or no. But, the colleague added, the answer was always right.
Ah, so minimal communication, but maximum accuracy. Not about the social aspect of chatting, just delivering the correct data point.
Pretty much. And Irene Joliot-Curie, again described as incapable of being indirect or using artifice in an argument. She'd present her thesis with implacable obstinacy, just meeting counter-arguments head-on.
Direct and unwavering.
Yeah, her imperturbable calm and directness could make her seem cold or maybe a bit haughty, even if that wasn't the intention.
The source also mentions some more physical things, like voice or gait.
Yeah, it touches on unusual vocalizations or ways of moving, which sometimes can be part of the picture. Lord Brougham remembered seeing Cavendish and hearing his shrill cry as he sort of shuffled quickly between rooms, apparently getting annoyed if people looked at him. His walk was called quick and uneasy.
Yeah.
And maybe more striking, the source claims both Einstein and Paul Dirac were echolalic.
Echolalic.
Repeating things they heard. Apparently for them, it might have been a way to process the information, to sort of check it by repeating it back.
Both Einstein and Dirac did that. That's a really specific, surprising link the source makes.
It is, isn't it? Beyond those core traits, the article brings in a few other relevant points, like sensitivity to criticism.
Ah, yes. You mentioned Newton maybe making the Principia hard to read because of that.
Exactly. He had an inordinate sensitiveness to personal criticism or anything touching his honor. And Cavendish, too, highly sensitive to criticism. The source suggests that's why he published so little.
How?
Only 2 papers on electricity during his whole life. But after he died, they found something like 20 packages of unpublished manuscripts on the topic.
20 packages. So The fear of criticism might have literally kept groundbreaking work hidden.
It's a possibility the source raises, yeah, a real potential barrier.
Wow.
Now, on a different note, the article highlights Einstein's passion for music.
Right, the violin.
Yeah, he was an enthusiastic violinist, loved Bach, Mozart, Schubert. Apparently said music was as important to him as physics, saw it as a way to be independent of people, maybe even the most important thing in his life.
That's quite a statement.
It is, and the source points out that photos of him playing music, often with others, show a different side to the usual solitary image. Maybe music was a different kind of connection or expression for him?
That adds a nice bit of complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not all just social difficulty.
Definitely. The source also brings up a potential family or genetic aspect. It says a genetic factor is certainly involved, though it's not simple inheritance. More like there's usually some trace elsewhere in the family.
Any examples given?
It flags the Joliot-Curie family, notes both Marie and her husband Pierre were introverted, and their daughter Irene seemed to strongly resemble her uncompromising mother, Marie.
So maybe Marie Curie had traits too.
The source suggests Marie herself showed some signs hard to engage with sometimes, naive social interpretations, that obsessive determination we mentioned, and apparently feeling things very violently.
So maybe both mother and daughter.
The source kind of leans towards thinking both might have fit the profile, but feels the evidence presented is stronger for Irene. It also makes the point that since Asperger's is diagnosed much more often in men, like a 5-to-1 ratio,
Right.
having potential female examples like the Curies is particularly interesting if the assessment holds up.
Yeah, that gender ratio is significant. And this whole discussion trying to diagnose historical figures, it really highlights how much our understanding has shifted, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source makes a point of saying that autism, generally, has only really been recognized by psychiatrists in the last, say, 60 years, which means, historically, tons of people would have just been seen as eccentric or peculiar, not diagnosed.
So behaviors we might now see as fitting a pattern were just individual quirks back then.
Pretty much. And the author actually expresses surprise that even modern biographers, particularly of someone like Einstein, often seem to overlook this angle. Even though, according to the source, it's widely accepted in some circles that Einstein showed these characteristics.
Wait, widely accepted about Einstein, but often left out of biographies. That seems odd.
It's a strong claim in the source, yeah. It really suggests our frameworks for understanding genius and just human difference are still catching up or evolving, which leads into another concept the source brings up from Simon Baron-Cohen.
The psychiatrist you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. His ideas of folk psychology versus folk physics.
Okay, refresh us quickly on those.
Sure. Folk psychology is basically that intuitive knack most people have for understanding other people, reading expressions, guessing intentions, social intuition, essentially.
Got it. Reading people.
And folk physics is the knack for understanding systems, objects, the physical world, the kind of thinking needed by engineers, architects, physicists, even skilled craftspeople.
Understanding things in systems.
Right. And Baron-Cohen's suggestion, as presented in the source, is that people with Asperger's might have a relative deficit in folk psychology,
Difficulty reading people.
but often have an unusual ability or strength in folk physics.
So a potential trade-off. Less intuitive understanding of people, maybe, but exceptional understanding of systems.
That's the model the source discusses. And it mentions a survey at Cambridge University that seemed to support this.
Oh, what did it find?
It found that students who met the criteria for Asperger syndrome were most likely to be found among those studying subjects heavy on folk physics, so math, physics, engineering, computer science.
That lines up almost exactly with what Hans Asperger observed back in the 40s, with the professions his subjects excelled in.
It's a striking echo across the decades, isn't it?
Yeah.
And finally, the article makes sure to include perspectives from people who actually have Asperger syndrome, which is crucial.
Absolutely. What did it say?
It mentions they often feel a great feeling of joy when they meet others like them, and that generally they're glad there isn't a cure.
That's powerful.
It really is. The source quotes a young person with AS, Luke Jackson, saying, "To cure someone of AS would be like taking away their personality and some really cool abilities too."
Wow. Yeah, that really reframes it away from just being a disorder. It's part of who they are, linked to strengths.
Exactly. And they basically ask for a little more understanding from society because navigating a world not always built for them can be tough. They often have a particularly bad time at school, the source notes, and many people just don't properly understand the condition, finding it hard to see how someone who might seem handicapped in social ways can achieve so much in other areas.
That adds such an important human perspective. It's not just about historical figures. It's about real people's lives today.
Definitely.
Okay, wow. So this deep dive into your source really took us through quite a journey. We look at these suggested traits linked to Asperger's, the social challenges, the intense focus, the different thinking styles, and saw how the author ties them to examples from the lives of Newton, Cavendish, Einstein, the Curies.
Yeah, it really shows how looking through a specific lens, like the one this article provides, can highlight potential patterns and connections you might otherwise miss in just reading standard biographies.
It certainly offers a different perspective on maybe the relationship between personality, how someone's brain works, and achieving truly groundbreaking things. We've really unpacked the source's view on how these traits might have played a role in scientific success, all based on the info you shared.
Examining these incredibly influential lives through this particular framework, well, it gives you a fascinating alternative way to think about their behavior and maybe the roots of their unique contributions.
Definitely food for thought. And just as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave you, the listener, with that really provocative quote from Hans Asperger himself, right back at the start, as presented in the source. It seems that for success in science or art, a dash of autism is essential. What does that make you think? About genius, about difference, about how we even understand extraordinary achievements. Something to mull over.